A cold, spectral mist clings to the ancient volcanic peaks of Puy de las Solas, a jagged crown of fire-forged rock in the heart of France. This is a landscape carved by primordial violence and sculpted by millennia of silence, a place that feels outside of time, where the air is thin and carries the weight of forgotten ages. On the morning of December 13, 1973, this profound quiet was disturbed by the hum of a single engine. A 27-year-old sports car journalist and aspiring singer named Claude Vorilhon was navigating the winding roads. He was a man accustomed to the roar of engines and the applause of small crowds, a life defined by speed and sound. Yet on this day he was seeking its opposite, a deep, resonant solitude. What he claims to have found, however, was not the peace of emptiness, but a presence that would shatter the quiet of his life, and eventually the lives of thousands, filling their inner worlds with a new, all-consuming voice. According to his account, the sky did not tear open with a crash of thunder, but parted with a silent, graceful descent. A silver craft, shaped like a flattened bell and humming with an energy that felt less like a sound and more like a pressure against the skin, hovered just above the frozen ground. It cast no shadow. Its presence was a clean, surgical intrusion into the raw, chaotic nature surrounding it, a piece of impossible geometry against the organic world. From this vessel, a ramp extended without a whisper, and a being emerged. It was small, no more than 4 feet tall, with pale green skin that seemed to absorb the weak winter light. Its dark, almond-shaped eyes held no discernible emotion, and a soft, dark beard framed a countenance that was unnervingly serene, almost beatific. It moved with a liquid grace that was both beautiful and deeply unnatural. It did not offer threats or ultimatums. It offered a revelation delivered in perfect, unaccented French, a story that promised to unravel every religion, every myth, every human origin story ever told, dismantling the very foundations of human identity in a calm, methodical monologue. The message was simple, yet world-shattering. We were not made by a god in the heavens, but by scientists in a laboratory on a distant world. Extraterrestrial beings, a civilization known as the Elohim, a word, he was told, mistranslated by ancient scribes from a plural meaning those who came from the sky, had designed all life on Earth through advanced genetic engineering. We were their image, their grand, beautiful, and flawed experiment. This encounter, this supposed truth bestowed upon a lone journalist in the dormant volcano, was not meant to be a secret. It was a mandate. Claude Vorilhon was to be their final messenger, their prophet for the atomic age. He was given a new name, Raël, and a mission to prepare humanity for the return of its creators. This mission came with a blueprint for a new world, a future free from the old dogmas of guilt and shame. It promised eternal life through science, a society built on sensual fulfillment, and humanity's eventual glorious return to the stars. But this seed of cosmic liberation would grow into a forest of tangled ideologies, where the promise of ultimate freedom would demand absolute devotion. The path to enlightenment for thousands of followers would be paved with personal sacrifice, psychological surrender, and a loyalty to one man that would blur the line between prophet and puppeteer. The story of the Raelians is not just about UFOs. It is a chilling examination of how a fantastic story can build a global empire of belief, and how, in the search for a higher truth, the human spirit can become imprisoned by the very promises that were meant to set it free. To understand how such a fantastic story could take root, one must look at the soil in which it was planted. The mid-1970s were a time of deep spiritual and social fractures, a decade caught between the failed utopian dreams of the 60s and the cold, pragmatic materialism of the 80s. The air was thick with a unique blend of paranoia and possibility. The Cold War cast a long nuclear shadow over the future,
a constant, low-humming anxiety that made the end of the world feel not like a biblical prophecy, but a political probability. Simultaneously, science and technology were advancing at a speed that felt both miraculous and terrifying. Humanity had walked on the moon, but back on Earth, political scandals like Watergate had eroded faith in the very institutions meant to provide order and meaning. Into this vacuum of certainty came a surge of new beliefs, a cultural marketplace of alternative realities. Mainstream religion felt archaic to a generation that had questioned everything. This created a profound spiritual hunger, and people sought nourishment in unconventional places. Eastern mysticism, New Age philosophies, and a burgeoning fascination with the cosmos. It was the golden age of the UFO phenomenon. The theories of ancient astronauts, popularized by authors like Erich von Däniken, were not just tabloid fodder. They were best-selling books, discussed with serious curiosity. The idea that humanity's gods were not divine beings, but technologically advanced visitors from other worlds, was a powerful, modern myth that resonated deeply in a secularizing world. It offered a way to believe in something grander than oneself without resorting to ancient scriptures. It was in this climate of questioning and cosmic curiosity that Claude Vorilhon, now reborn as Raël, took his first steps. He was the perfect messenger for the moment. He wasn't a wild-eyed mystic. He was a former sports journalist and race car driver, a man of the modern world. He published a book, The Book Which Tells the Truth, presenting it not as a holy text of divine revelation, but as a direct, factual transcription of the Elohim's message. He began to hold conferences in France, speaking not with the fire of a zealot, but with the cool, assured tone of a reporter delivering a world-changing scoop. His message was intoxicatingly simple and profoundly radical. It offered a clean escape from the old world's contradictions. There was no judgmental God, only scientifically advanced creators. There was no original sin, only a genetic blueprint. Miracles were merely misunderstood technology. For people adrift in a sea of doubt, this was an anchor. It was a belief system for the atomic age, a religion that didn't require you to abandon reason, but to embrace it in a new cosmic context. But this is only the first layer of the story. What began as a philosophy of intellectual liberation was already building the foundations of a rigid hierarchical structure, where one man's word was the unquestionable link to the stars, and the promise of ultimate freedom would slowly begin to demand absolute control. The initial philosophy, as radical as it was, needed a vessel. An idea without a structure is like a ghost. It can haunt, but it cannot build. Raël understood this instinctively. The informal gatherings in rented halls and private homes, buzzing with intellectual excitement, were no longer enough. In 1974, this loose collection of followers and curious onlookers was formalized into an organization, MADEC, a French acronym for the Movement for the Welcoming of the Elohim, Creators of Humanity. The name itself was a statement of purpose, a shift from passive belief to active preparation. This was no longer a debating society. It was a reception committee for gods from outer space. With this new structure came a symbol, one designed to be as provocative as the message itself, a swastika interlaced within a Star of David. To Raël, it was a profound emblem of cosmic harmony, representing the cycle of time within the infinity of space, a union of ancient spiritual concepts predating their dark 20th century meanings. To the outside world, however, it was a deeply offensive paradox, an impossible marriage of the executioner and the victim. But the controversy was the point. It was a deliberate act of psychological severance, a filter designed to separate the truly committed from the merely curious. To embrace the symbol was to publicly reject the world's historical baggage and pledge allegiance to a new cosmic interpretation of reality, Raël's interpretation. It was a declaration of separation from family, friends, and a society that could only see hatred in their sacred sign. A hierarchy quickly crystallized around him.
The man who was once a fellow seeker of truth was now elevated, becoming the guide of guides, the final and most important prophet in a long line that supposedly included Jesus, Buddha, and Mohammed. Beneath him, a tiered system of guides, bishops, and priests was established, creating a pyramid of authority that flowed directly and unquestioningly from the top. Loyalty was no longer just to the idea, but to the chain of command. The movement was then given its grand unifying quest to build an embassy, a neutral territory with extraterritorial status, to officially welcome the Elohim back to Earth. This was a masterstroke of organizational genius. It transformed abstract belief into tangible, unending work. It required money, land, and unwavering dedication, channeling every ounce of hope, every spare franc, every moment of free time into a single collective goal. The promise of cosmic enlightenment now came with earthly obligations.
The path to ultimate freedom was being paved with the stones of absolute obedience, and the followers, believing they were building a bridge to the stars, were in fact constructing the walls of a new reality, with Raël as its sole architect. The mission to build the embassy was the movement's visible engine, a concrete goal that gave believers a shared sense of purpose. It was a project of steel and glass, a monument to their collective faith. But Raël, ever the strategist, knew that a physical structure was meaningless if the people within it were not rebuilt first. An embassy of the body and soul had to be constructed, its old architecture of guilt and shame demolished to make way for a new design. This internal renovation would mark the movement's great turning point, the moment it pivoted from the cosmos to the self. In 1975, Raël announced a second, more intimate encounter with the Elohim. This was not a public message for humanity, but a private lesson for its prophet.
He claimed he was taken aboard their ship and given a deeper, more transformative teaching. When he returned, the message was no longer just about humanity's origins, it was about its destiny. A future that could only be unlocked by radically redefining the very essence of what it meant to be human. He introduced a practice he called sensual meditation. On the surface, it was presented as a therapeutic technique for awakening the senses, for experiencing the universe with a heightened awareness that had been dulled by millennia of repressive religious morality. In quiet, controlled seminars, followers were guided to focus on their bodies, on the subtle electricity of touch, the vibration of sound, the scent of the air. It was framed as a scientific path to enlightenment, a way to harmonize one's own genetic code with the cosmic frequency of the Elohim. But beneath this veneer of wellness and spiritual science, a silent and systematic reprogramming was taking place. These sessions were designed to systematically dismantle personal inhibitions, one boundary at a time. The concepts of monogamy, jealousy, and sexual exclusivity were not just questioned, they were pathologized, reframed as primitive, possessive instincts inherited from a less evolved past, social diseases to be cured. True spiritual advancement, Raël now preached, required absolute freedom, especially sexual freedom. This was the point of rupture. The movement began to morph from a UFO research group into a living laboratory for a new social order. The intellectual quest for truth was now fused with a deeply personal, physical, and emotional mandate. To be a good Raelian was no longer just to believe in the Elohim, it was to actively perform a lifestyle that shattered the norms of the outside world. This new doctrine was a powerful and brutal sorting mechanism. For some, it was the ultimate liberation, a permission slip to explore desires they had long suppressed, all within a community that celebrated their choices as spiritually evolved. But for others, it was a profound violation, a moment where a belief system they had joined for its cosmic vision suddenly demanded access to the most private corners of their lives, their marriages, their very sense of self. The choice was no longer abstract, it was visceral. To stay meant to surrender one's personal boundaries to the group's ideology, an ideology now dictated entirely by Raël. The grand project of the alien embassy, once the central focus, began to feel like a distant dream. The primary project was now the creation of a new kind of human being, one free from the chains of traditional morality, and Raël was its sole engineer.
The promise of freedom was becoming a new kind of cage, one where the walls were invisible, built from the follower's own liberated desires, and the only key was held by the guide of guides. Here, in this crucible of manufactured liberation, the line between spiritual awakening and psychological capture dissolved into nothing. Within this new reality, a rigid hierarchy began to crystallize, hidden beneath a veneer of egalitarian love. At the top, of course, was Raël, the living prophet. Below him, a council of guides and bishops enforced the doctrine, their authority derived directly from their proximity to him. They were the gatekeepers of the new consciousness, and their role was to identify and dismantle the psychological resistance of new members. The primary tool for this was the Seminar of Awakening. Held in secluded locations, these multi-day events were intense, immersive experiences designed to systematically break down old identities. They were cauldrons of emotional and sensory overload. Days were filled with lectures on Elohim science and sensual meditation. Nights were a blur of music, dancing, and encouraged physical intimacy. The air itself seemed thick with a potent mixture of spiritual fervor and sanctioned hedonism. Here, the concept of consent was subtly re-engineered. To refuse an advance, to express jealousy, or to cling to a monogamous relationship was to be unawakened, still trapped in the guilt-ridden programming of the old world. Freedom was redefined as the obligation to be available, and love was a communal resource, not a private bond. But this is only the first layer of this story. The most potent symbol of this new order was the creation of the Order of Angels, an elite group of women whose stated mission was to welcome the Elohim upon their return and to serve their prophet Raël in the meantime. They were presented as the pinnacle of female enlightenment, women who had transcended possessiveness and jealousy. In reality, they became a powerful instrument of control. Their devotion was a public spectacle, a standard against which all other female followers were measured. For men, access to these enlightened women was a reward for loyalty and financial contribution. For women, becoming an angel was the highest possible spiritual achievement, a path that required surrendering personal autonomy for the collective good, a good defined entirely by the leadership. The psychological pressure was immense. To question the arrangement was to question the entire cosmic plan. But manipulating the desires of the present was only one part of the equation. To secure absolute loyalty, the movement needed to control the future itself. And it found the perfect mechanism, the promise of eternal life through cloning. In the late 1990s, Raël announced the founding of Clonaid, a company dedicated to human cloning. The message was simple and devastatingly effective. The Elohim had mastered this science, and through Raël, humanity could too. Death was no longer an end, but merely a technical problem to be solved. For devoted followers, this was the ultimate reward. Their DNA could be stored, and upon their death, a new body could be cloned for them, into which their consciousness and memories would be downloaded. The movement was no longer just offering a better life. It was offering to defeat mortality. This doctrine cemented Raël's power in a way nothing else could. He was no longer just a messenger. He was the gatekeeper to eternity. Leaving the movement now meant more than social ostracism. It meant embracing oblivion. Financial donations were no longer just for building an embassy. They were investments in personal immortality. The control was now total, extending beyond the confines of life on Earth and into the very fabric of existence. The Raelian world had become a closed loop, a self-referencing reality where every doubt was a spiritual failure and every sacrifice was a step closer to eternal life. The invisible cage was complete. The true test of this invisible cage arrived on December 27, 2002. On that day, the world's media turned its cameras towards a small company called Clonaid and its director, Raelian Bishop Bridget Boisselet. The announcement was seismic, a claim that would shatter the boundaries of science and ethics. The first human clone, a baby girl nicknamed Eve, had been born. For a few frantic weeks, the Raelian movement was no longer a fringe curiosity. It was the center of a global firestorm. The story was a perfect storm of scientific taboo, religious prophecy, and media spectacle. Boisselet, poised and confident, faced a ravenous press, promising that proof was imminent. For the followers, this was the ultimate validation. The science of the Elohim was finally being made manifest on Earth, just as Raël had foretold. But the proof never came. The scientific community, once cautiously intrigued, became openly dismissive. The requests for independent DNA verification were met with a series of evasions and excuses. The story of Eve, the supposed harbinger of a new age of immortality, slowly dissolved into a haze of unproven claims and public ridicule. The Clonaid episode was a spectacular failure in a public court, yet internally it served a different purpose. It didn't break the faith of the devoted. It reinforced their sense of persecution. The world's skepticism was merely proof of its unawakened state, its inability to accept the truth offered by the Elohim. The movement retreated from the mainstream spotlight, but it did not vanish. It adapted, migrating to the new, fertile ground of the Internet.
In the digital ether, its message could travel without borders, finding isolated individuals searching for meaning in a world they felt disconnected from. The glossy websites and social media channels presented a sanitized version of Raelianism, a philosophy of peace, love, and scientific progress, stripped of its more demanding internal politics. The organization also learned to harness the power of minor, provocative acts to generate publicity. Campaigns like Go Topless Day, framed as a fight for gender equality, or the promotion of the swastika as a symbol of peace, were designed to capture headlines and draw in the curious. These were no longer grand pronouncements of cloned babies, but smaller, more sustainable acts of cultural disruption. They kept the Raelian name in circulation, a constant, low-level hum in the background noise of modern culture. But the most profound modern consequence of the Raelian movement is not found in its public stunts or its online presence.
It is etched into the lives of those who have left. For them, exiting the movement is not simply a change of belief. It is like waking from a decades-long dream. The world outside the invisible cage is jarring, its colors too sharp, its rules arbitrary and confusing. They must learn to rebuild their identities from the ground up, to disentangle their own desires from those that were manufactured for them. They grapple with a profound sense of loss of community, loss of purpose, and most painfully, the loss of the promise of eternal life. The world no longer holds the certainty it once did. Love is no longer a communal resource, but a complex, often frightening personal risk. Freedom is not a prescribed set of behaviors, but a terrifying, undefined void. This is the enduring legacy of the movement, a generation of people set adrift, left to navigate the wreckage of a reality they were taught to believe was the ultimate liberation. Consider the story of a woman we will call Sylvie. She was not a lost soul in the traditional sense, but a university student of philosophy. Sharp and inquisitive, yet deeply disillusioned with a world that seemed to offer only cynicism and materialism. She was studying ancient belief systems, seeing them as beautiful but ultimately flawed relics. Then she found the Raelians, or perhaps they found her, through a brightly colored pamphlet promising answers not in dusty texts, but in the stars. The message was intoxicatingly modern. Humanity was not a cosmic accident, but a deliberate scientific creation. Love, in its purest, most liberated form, was the key to unlocking our potential. For Sylvie, who craved a spirituality compatible with the scientific mind, it felt like coming home. She spent 15 years inside the movement. Her old life faded like a photograph left in the sun. Her family became distant, worried voices on the phone, their concerns easily dismissed as the programming of an old, dying world. Her new family was the movement, a vibrant, all-encompassing ecosystem. They shared meals, meditations, and a singular, unifying purpose that made every day feel significant. She worked tirelessly, donating her income to the embassy project, her DNA carefully registered for the promise of cloning. She believed with every fiber of her being that she was part of the most important project in human history, a vanguard of consciousness. The breaking point was not a grand dramatic event, but a quiet, sickening moment of dissonance. It happened during a summer seminar, in a room filled with the scent of incense and the sound of soft music. She witnessed a high-ranking guide publicly humiliate a new member for expressing a flicker of jealousy, framing it as a spiritual failure. The guide's words were smooth, cloaked in the language of liberation and enlightenment. But later that evening, Sylvie saw that same guide in a heated, private argument with his partner, his face contorted with a raw, possessive anger that was all too human. It was a small crack in the perfect facade, but through it she saw the raw, unvarnished machinery of power at play. The philosophy was a beautiful cloak, but underneath it was the same old story of control, ego, and hypocrisy. Leaving was like tearing her own skin off. The community that had nurtured her instantly turned cold, its unconditional love revealed to be highly conditional. She was excommunicated, labeled a traitor to the cause of humanity. The promise of eternal life was rescinded, replaced by the terrifying silence of oblivion. For the first year, she lived in a fog of fear and disorientation. Every choice, from what to eat for breakfast to how to form a friendship, was a monumental task.
She had to learn who she was without the guidance of a prophet, without the constant reflection of 1,000 like-minded believers. Sylvie's story is not one of a dramatic escape, but of a quiet, painful reclamation of the self. Today, she finds meaning not in the cosmos, but in the small, tangible realities of her life. The warmth of a coffee cup, the complexity of a new relationship built on trust rather than doctrine, the difficult, uncertain work of building a future that is entirely her own. She is no longer waiting for a spaceship. She is learning to navigate the Earth one uncertain step at a time, finding a profound and terrifying beauty in the freedom she never knew she had lost. Sylvie's journey from cosmic certainty to earthly uncertainty is not just one person's story. It is a map of a fundamental human landscape, a terrain where the deep hunger for meaning meets the seductive power of absolute answers. Sylvie's journey from cosmic certainty to earthly uncertainty is not just one person's story. It is a map of a fundamental human landscape, a terrain where the deep hunger for meaning meets the seductive power of absolute answers. The history of the Raelian movement, in the end, is not truly about aliens, spaceships, or clones. It is about us. It is about our profound, often desperate need to believe that we are not a cosmic accident, that our lives are part of a grander design, and that death is not the final word. In a world where traditional religions have receded for many, leaving behind a vacuum of purpose, new mythologies rush in to fill the void. Raelianism was a perfect mythology for the modern age, wrapping ancient human desires in the gleaming foil of science fiction and progressive ideals. This is the fertile ground where prophets are born. They offer a simple, powerful transaction. In exchange for your devotion, you will receive certainty. In exchange for your obedience, you will receive purpose. And in exchange for your autonomy, you will receive a community that shields you from the terrifying silence of the universe. The movement's genius was not in its specific doctrines, but in its ability to create a complete, self-contained reality. It built an invisible cage whose bars were not made of steel, but of shared ecstasy, a sense of enlightened superiority, and the ultimate promise of immortality. Within this reality, language itself was re-engineered. Freedom came to mean the obligation to shed all inhibitions. Love became a depersonalized communal resource. Critical thinking was repurposed to mean defending the doctrine against the outside world, not questioning it from within. The Raelian movement shows us that the most effective ideologies are not those that openly oppress, but those that redefine freedom as a willing submission to a higher truth, a truth held, invariably, by a chosen few. It demonstrates how the promise of utopia can be used to justify the erosion of the self.
The followers were not just passive victims. They were active participants in the construction of their own gilded cage, convinced that in surrendering their old identities, they were achieving a higher state of being. This dynamic is timeless, a recurring pattern in human history where the allure of a perfect system outweighs the messy, imperfect reality of individual freedom. The ultimate question this story leaves us with is not whether the Elohim exist. It is about how we navigate our own search for truth in an age of infinite information and fractured realities. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable possibility that what we often seek is not truth, but comfort, not liberation, but the relief of no longer having to choose. Perhaps the most dangerous cages are not those with visible bars, but those built from beautiful, comforting answers to questions we are too afraid to live with.
The path to genuine liberation may not lie in finding a prophet who can tell us who we are, or a system that provides all the answers. It may lie in embracing the difficult, uncertain, and sometimes lonely work of figuring it out for ourselves, moment by moment. The search for our creators in the stars can sometimes make us forget the most necessary and sacred creation of all, our own self. Forged not in the light of absolute certainty, but in the crucible of doubt, choice, and the courage to face the unknown. If this story gave you pause for thought, subscribe for more journeys into the complex heart of our shared human experience.